Well, good morning. It's a huge honor to be here, especially doing a keynote for such a cool conference. I'm a self-proclaimed old fart of the industry. I've been hacking since 1992, and it's quite cool to see this many conferences and this many people involved and passionate about an industry that was really, really small when we started. And even more so because, over the last couple of years, Hollywood really has gotten into the whole hacking scene. And we have amazing movies that depict hacking today, because everybody today writes worms like this, Hugh Grant, and we tap away at the keyboard, and it's quite cool. But the dark reality is that hacking as an industry has become so mainstream now. When my mother-in-law, who is 64, old, gets hold of me when she gets a phishing message to say, is this legit or am I going to be attacked? So I'm like, this is quite a cool experience for us to be in. And just as a show of hands, how many of you are quite new to the industry? Less than 2 years. So a fair chunk, so welcome. Portugal has quite a close space in my heart. In the early days of South Africa, when I started to learn to hack, South Africa has a very large Portuguese community, and there were a few hacking groups from Portugal that really did some amazing stuff back in the days. The first was Pulhas. I doubt there's anybody here from Pulhas, but Pulhas were really cool because they were kind of one of the first major exploit groups out there, and they did a lot to really advance the whole exploit world, and it was quite cool to be able to come and speak in Portugal because I knew that they were doing it. You then had Toxin. And what was interesting about Toxin for me was one of the first politically motivated hacking groups out there. At the time, East Timor was being invaded, and they decided that they were going to go after anybody doing bad stuff against that country. And bear in mind, this was 1994 that they were doing it. And then finally, it wouldn't be an industry without trolls. And our industry does really well with trolls. And for that, we had 4packs. 4packs at the time were a very annoying group, but they were very good at trolling a lot of people on the internet back in the day. Their ultimate, downfall was that they decided to hack a US military organization, which is possibly not the best thing to do if you're a small group. There are a few countries in the world you generally try not to piss off. US military is one of them. But what's kind of happened is that, like I said, hacking has become really big and mainstream. And we now have amazing TV shows that actually do depict what it's like to hack. Now, a lot of you will realize it's not the most glamorous thing in the world. We are sitting, looking at screens, typing away, wondering why stuff doesn't compile. Damn it worked yesterday, why is it not working now? But the cool thing is that everybody still thinks it's quite an intriguing industry. And actually, it is, if you look at it. Now, there are still some instances where Hollywood gets it wrong. NCIS spins it, because I think we all do double hacking, right? Definitely a thing. And it's quite interesting to see that that's how a lot of the insiders view our industry. And no more so than the last couple of years. There's been a whole wide range of incidents that have kind of happened to our industry that's made hacking and hackers quite predominant in the way that we shape the world. This gentleman, his name is Marco Ramos. He is the San Bernardino's district attorney. And I think it was last year before last, when the San Bernardino terrorist incident happened, where an active shooter went around shooting people, they gained access to his iPhone. Sorry. And he came up with a quote that has never left me. He said that there might be a lying dormant cyber pathogen on the phone. And that sums up for me what a lot of outsiders think about our industry. They think that we create chemical weapons with our code. And in hindsight, the more I've thought about this quote, the more of it actually runs true. Because we live in a time now where through our keyboards, we can control companies, we can control continents. We can shape how history is made, all through keyboards. And if you look at the FBI, they sum this up quite nicely, because they now have their own Cyber's Most Wanted. Now, this is the infamous GRU hacking team. For those of you who don't know, Russian spies who become hackers. Not the best hackers, because if you're going to go and hack the, companies that look for, say, doping, you generally don't do it with a pineapple outside of a rented car, sitting looking really dodgy, because 4 burly Russian men with leather jackets, we're going to do some hugging, doesn't really fit in. OPSEC, bro. But still, they got caught. But the fact of the matter is, we still have the FBI, who now has a dedicated cyber page. And this is fascinating. We've come a long way. So, how many of you here remember the old dancing baby? Shit was wild back in the early days of the internet. That was cutting edge. For those who don't, you missed nothing, trust me. This is what we thought we were cool. But the irony is, we now have 5.1 billion mobile phone users. 5.1 billion people now use the internet today for practically most of their digital life. WeChat was launched the other month. WeChat is a great way of paying for money using WeChat. It's a phenomenal thing. In the first week, they gained 130 million customers. A lot of the stuff that we build and we engineer and we pen test and we hack today impacts more people than we've ever imagined. So that asks the question, surely security is getting better, right? Not sure about that. This is a report from Accenture, understanding how some of the breaches are happening. And some of the stuff is quite telling. As somebody who's been involved in security for a very long time, it's also a little bit embarrassing. Because malware is up, web-based attacks up, denial of service is up. The fact of the matter is, it's never been easier to hack. We now have the likes of YouTube. We have more information being shared before than ever. And yet, seemingly, we're still struggling with making stuff quite secure. And that moves into the next one. You can't talk about hacking without talking about politics. The fact of the matter remains, our weapons are our keyboards. I know that's a very cliched thing to say on a Friday morning in Lisbon, but the reality is it's quite true. Because organizations and government units are now using a lot of our research to seriously start impacting normal human life. So it's a known fact that the Saudis are not the nicest players in the world. And this story came out, excuse me, the other week, where it turns out that they were going against human rights activists and owning their devices and forcing them to say nice things about His Royal Highness. They managed to do so from a company that I will happily call the Internet Cancer NSO Group. A company that loves to peddle misery onto lots and lots of people around the world. And they do so to the highest bidder. Then, last week, we learned about the China cables. Now, the China cables was quite interesting because we finally got insight through a lot of leaked documents as to how China is creating the biggest mass surveillance system this planet has ever seen. Surveillance of Uyghurs, the Uyghur Muslims, against people who go against the Chinese government. And they do so through a massive, complex networks of surveillance, infiltration, exfiltration, and tracking of people. And that is facilitated, by and large, our industry. And our industry helps a lot of that. But the good thing is, we also had a lot of internet cyber sleuths. And I know there's a talk later about scanning the internet. And it's because of stuff like this, where Victor Givers managed to find this company who was working with the Chinese, Communist Party called SenseNet, who struggles with security just like everybody else. And they somehow managed to leave a lot of databases online. Those databases showed how big this problem was. 6.7 million location points linked to people, tagged with descriptions such as mosque, hotel, internet cafe, and other places where surveillance cameras were most likely installed. We've helped facilitate such an industrial surveillance system through a lot of our research. And I think that's one of the things that's concerned me as a researcher as to how much we're helping these countries do really bad stuff. But at the same time, human beings also help this along. So this is an app on the left called Zao. It is the most downloaded free app in the Chinese App Store as of September this year. And I'm sure many of you have tried it. Did anybody else try the Facebook app where you manage to age yourself? Show of hands. Nobody tried it. Phenomenal. this app might seem quite innocent. You could pretend to be your favorite Chinese movie star or anybody else. The harsh reality behind this app was that it was actually used to train machine learning models to do surveillance of persecuted minorities. Because how else would you manage to train models on millions of people without saying, here's a cute app, run it. Oh, you look like Leonardo DiCaprio. That's great. The reality is that we're helping a lot of these regimes do ugly stuff. And then you have companies that shape democracy itself. Now, unfortunately, I live in a country called England, and England is full of weird racists who think that exiting the European Union was a good thing. Now, it's a bit of an embarrassment, but the reality is that the Brexit campaign was not a free and fair campaign. It was manipulated by a company called Cambridge Analytica. Christopher Wiley was one of the data scientists, and they had a simple idea. What happens if we bring big data and social media to an established military methodology? The methodology of PSYOPs, psychological operations. And what they did was they targeted individuals in regions of the United Kingdom where they knew that they could subvert their thoughts and force them to vote for something that they never really thought about, and do so by constant bombarding of images, of messages, and so on. And that's effectively how Cambridge Analytica worked. They used SOCMENT, they used HUMINT, they used SIGINT. They used a lot of military terms, and they managed to sway an entire population to vote for something that was incredibly stupid. But they also did against the US electorate. All using technology and ideas that were spoken about at conferences years before. So, sorry. It's really hard to go through and do what we do without understanding the impact that we have on the world. And from a personal perspective, that's impacted me 8 times now. This is APT-33, the Iranian National Guard. And as with all countries out there, they've made use of hacking techniques to gain access to information and ideas that wouldn't necessarily be part of what they would normally access. Iran has plenty of sanctions on it, so the only way they're going to get access to information is through breaking in. And we learned last year that, unfortunately, Iran used a tool that I helped push out onto the internet called Ruler, and that was how they gained access to a lot of large-scale industrial enterprises. And it sits quite uneasy with you when you realize that something that you helped build, your proof of concept, the stuff that you thought was good in trying to change the world, was actually being used for evil. But it also made me realize that you can't be naive in this industry and not think that we are being watched quite heavily. That wasn't also the first time. There's plenty more as this talk will go into. Then finally, the juggernaut in the room. Everybody here is aware of Kim Jong-un. Probably built the greatest hacking team ever known to man. Loves to ride horses and takes long walks in forests. But what he did do was weaponize North Korean aspects so that when they target companies or countries, there was not much you could do. To give you an example, if North Korea is attacking your network, what do? You can go to local law enforcement, who will probably look at you and go, I don't know what you want me to do, it's North Korea. You then go to your politician, and your politician will probably say, it's North Korea, it's tricky, there's sanctions, but they also have nuclear weapons, and they're pretty big. That was the effectiveness of North Korea. And what Kim managed to do was do something that a lot of smaller criminals wanted to do for a very, very long time, and that was break into banks. And he did so in Bangladesh. But what was interesting about that whole process was his team adopted very similar agile approaches and techniques that had been spoken about for a very long time prior to that. So here are 2 pieces of malware. On the left, it was the sample submitted from the Bangladesh Swift attack. Right? On the right, this was a relatively new sample that's been pushed in. And the one thing people who can't read assembly is that you'll see that the code is very similar, but it has small modifications. And that was key to how North Korea does a lot of their intrusions. They never stop morphing. They never stop changing their code, right? Because the one good thing that came out of the Bangladesh hack was that the global SWIFT network finally realized they had to make stuff a lot more secure. And they did so. But that didn't stop the North Korean Unit 121 or Lazarus or any of those small groups inside the industrial machine that is North Korea from adapting modern techniques that they saw at conferences and they saw online and they saw on GitHub to go, how do we stay one step ahead? Now, instantly, that sample on the right would break Sierra and a lot of other signature-based detection routines. So, for all case and matters, North Korea was very good at keeping up to date with what the security industry was doing. But they also learned a lot from what we did. As I said, Kim Jong has got some fantastic taste in horses and, photography. I wouldn't like to be the photographer who was told to take a picture of Kim Jong and, if you get it wrong, your whole family is wiped out. But the key thing is, if you look at any of the breaches that have happened from North Korea, there's key things that we can learn. One, the attackers had access to companies for a very long time. In some cases, over 180 days. Which means we as defenders and we as the security industry are very bad at detecting when stuff is happening inside our networks. Two, the malware was compiled days or hours before actually being used. And this was really interesting because a lot of the times when you do a red team, you don't necessarily do it on the fly. The North Koreans realized that by doing it on the fly, often they were able to bypass a held road protection mechanism. Finally, they made use of innocent decryptors, often stuff that was found straight from GitHub. These were innocent projects that somebody might have pushed out line thinking, who's going to be using this? When in reality, it was being used to break into banks. Finally, they did something that we've been doing for a long time. They didn't work in office hours. They didn't keep in scope. These are attackers breaking into stuff to steal lots of money. So they were learning a lot from what the red team pen testing industry has been saying for a long time. But it's just we weren't very good at acting about it. But all of that pales in comparison to the real master hacking crew. And that's China. One thing you have to hand it to China is that they've managed to industrialize and weaponize hacking like I've never seen before. Interesting story. Beijing decided and predicted that the demand for air travel in its growing middle-class Chinese communities would outstrip demand and supply. So what they needed to do was build a turbine engine that could facilitate the Chinese movement across the world. And part of that was they wanted to make sure that the China approach of being an advanced manufacturing leader was in operation. And to do so, they decided they were going to build a plane. And that plane was the C919. Now, what was different about this plane was that it was going to be half the price of any Western equivalent. Now, for any of you who have been involved in the aeronautical industry, it's a very complex industry. A single plane is made up of many, many companies with many, many different parts, right? You don't have a single plane built by one country or company. So what the Chinese did was they thought between the period of 2010 and 2015, they would use their amazing hacking teams, which was a culmination of Chinese underground hackers and the Ministry of State Security, MSS, and they would breach most of the companies in this picture. And they would become sleepers in the network. That was the first thing. The second thing that they did was they partnered with a company called CFM International, which was a joint venture between France and the USA. And that is the LEAP-X engine. That's a phenomenal turbine engine, which could be used for both the airplane and the military industry. They signed the agreements, but what happened a couple of years afterwards was China said, we need to make our own. So making use of underground hackers and MSS, they came up with this amazing engine that had multiple similarities with the LEAP engine. Stuff that was damn near identical. Dimensions, the turbofan blades, how it operated. Now, the cynical person in you might think, maybe it was just your thing, two designers working on an engine separated by an ocean. It must be the same. The reality is, China made use of the most powerful weapon that we've ever seen in hacking. HUMINT. Now, for those who are not military-based, HUMINT is the art of the human. What China did was they managed to put a whole lot of insiders into a lot of key important companies and use those insiders to help feed and grow the Chinese drive to become the most advanced manufacturing country in the world. And they did so by using exfiltration, by using covert comms, by stealing lots and lots of data. And this is a fascinating story because what MSS did was they attended conferences. They attended Black Hat and DEF CON and B-Sides, and they looked through GitHub, and they looked at people pushing out proof of concepts, and they used that information to really push forward the main goal. And that main goal was exfiltration of data. So, incidentally, I sit on the Black Hat review board, and we review thousands of submissions every year. 3 years ago, we noticed a complete drop of any submission from any Chinese researcher. And it was interesting because at the time, we would get a lot of very good research from Chinese researchers. But that all pretty much stopped. And it was due to Chinese government saying, all your research now belongs to China. You do not publish it anywhere else in the world. So we could see the control that a country would have on the hacking community. And now, as we're starting to dig further and further, we start to understand the impact of that research. And then finally, like I said, you can't talk about the internet without talking about its cancer. Is everybody here familiar with the NSO Group? A couple. NSO Group is a charming company based in Israel, and effectively, they are a lord of war. They will, for a considerable amount of money, sell you access to people's mobile phones and digital devices in order to exfiltrate data. Now, unfortunately, they don't care who they sell it to. Unlike, normal countries, but we don't generally go after those who try and protect human rights. NSO Group will go after anybody for you. And they built this amazing framework called Pegasus. And Pegasus is effectively a C2 malware delivery framework on steroids. The average cost is about 15 million, and it works really well. Because it has all the things that you'd expect from a commercial weaponized C2 framework. We've got our installations, we have data collection, data transmission, and presentation and analysis. But what Pegasus managed to do was make it point-and-click easy for any operator to go after people, to deliver malware that's undetectable, and then use that against those people. And this framework managed to collect a lot of data. Effectively, everything in your mobile phone was full game. Now, in recent months, there has been reports where the NSO have managed to have a finger put into their eye, notably from Natasha at Google Project Zero with the WhatsApp bugs. Their reach was like something I've never seen before, because you now had regimes like the Saudis and the Bangladeshis and everybody else who you would never want to have a weapon like this have access to this to go after really key people. NSO Group managed to do this through a lot of our research. And they made use of a lot of the concepts that we talk about, the ideas and the proof of the concepts that we push out to do this kind of damage. And to give you an idea of how bad it was, in Mexico, they decided that the sugar in soda drinks was a bad thing. And rightly so. So there was a sugar tax coming in. And, child obesity is getting worse. We know for a fact that sugar in the likes of Coke and Fanta and so on is not the best thing. Well, it seems that certain organizations would have lost a lot of money about this. So what they did was they targeted the politicians who were trying to bring in this law. And they did so using NSO capability. But they took it one step further. Out of interest, how many people in this room do pen testing or red teaming? So a fair few. What they did was, for the individuals that they knew that they could subvert and they wanted to keep tracks on, they sent SMSs. Now this SMS basically said, Mr. Simon, your daughter was in a grave accident, really bad condition. You need to come to the hospital now. Here's a link. Now, it might look really, really lame to a lot of the red teams and pen testers, but this was really effective because I'm a father of 2 boys. And if somebody had to send a message to me saying, hey, one of your kids has been in a bad accident, you kind of do lose the ability to think clearly. And they sent hundreds of these messages to everybody involved in the sugar tax thing. And this was all facilitated by NSO technology. But it's not always been like that. So, the early days of hacking, like I said, I started in the early 90s, and that was a phenomenal time for me to be in the research world, because the internet was kind of growing up. We were starting to see this thing called the World Wide Web. Yes, to those who've never imagined it, we didn't have the World Wide Web. It was really bad. But we also used a lot of creativity. So in 2001, I helped build a project called Smoothwall. Smoothwall was a firewall. And at the time, I was working at a company called PSINet. And PSINet, my main job was helping build the first generation internet. Now, hosting was really, really expensive. And we also needed to put out a patch for a vulnerability that we found in SSH. So what we did was, well, what I did was, using my hacker mindset, was that the 146.101.126.9 IP address was actually a hosting server where I'd commandeered to push patches out. Because I couldn't afford hosting, it was really expensive. So I thought, well, let me just borrow somebody else's at the time. That was the hacking mindset. You know, we built stuff, we explored stuff, and we did lots of interesting stuff. And now, when we were finding bugs, we did share it among other people. So earlier I mentioned Pullhas. You know, there were a lot of shouts going out. You would find a bug, you'd prove that it was an issue, you'd write exploit code. For my sins, I wrote it in Perl. Don't judge me. It was a different error. And when you were bored of the exploit, you would either move it onto a friends group or you'd do a trade. Just like Pedro talked about yesterday, trading hardware, we used to do the same with exploits. Now you would be an idiot to do that because you'd make a lot of money. So nobody trades exploits anymore. At least that way. But there was one incident that kind of started a massive movement against this. And that was CV 2002-0392. I'm sure a lot of you probably won't remember this one, but that was a chunked encoding vulnerability for Apache 1.3. Now I'm really showing my age. But effectively, if you sent a payload to an Apache web server, bad things happened. But it's fine because we had experts, right? We had this company called Internet Security Systems by Chris Ruland, and these experts decided it was not exploitable, right? They were strict about that. Cannot exploit it. Thankfully, there was a group out there called Gobbles. Gobbles were phenomenal. They were a breath of fresh air. And they decided, do you know what? Actually, we're going to look at the code. And they said that the experts have said it is not exploitable on 32-bit NIX variants. It's only exploitable on Win32. And what Gobbles did was now the infamous Apache nose job exploit that targeted both Sun Solaris 6.8, FreeBSD, OpenBSD, and Linux. Effectively, 99% of the internet. This single exploit was used a lot. It was used against Theodorat. They took down a server called monkey.org. Monkey.org was a server for a lot of the big security researchers at the time. Doug Song, K2, a lot of people. Their server got owned. In fact, Apache Nosejob was used to break into so many servers that it wasn't even funny anymore. Because if you were on the internet, there was no patch. You were being rampaged. I'm mad. Now, that kicked off a massive amount of discussion. And instantly, this happened yesterday. So Aziria is a friend of mine, and she managed to tweet out saying, responsible disclosed bugs published with a proof of concept doing more harm than good, since they're being weaponized and used by attackers. This is not a new argument. This argument has been going around for a very, very long time. Actually, 20 years. 20 years ago, a very, very annoying at the time group called EL8 published a series of zines. EL8 was the start of the anti-security movement. And what they wanted to do was eliminate the entire security industry that did reports about news, about exploits, about proof of concepts. And at the time it was quite annoying because they termed it Project Mayhem. And this, coupled with a lot of the exploits that they had, was the basis of them saying, enough now. By us releasing the research that gives attackers the skills and the tools they need to do, we're not doing anything good for the internet. And it was pretty good because, at the time I was on the receiving end of this. A lot of the people, I wouldn't expect you to read this, but effectively they wanted to stop people pushing it out. There's one site there that you might notice called hack.coza. That was probably one of the first exploit sites that I was involved in and helped run. We used to give away exploits, very similar to Millworm now, but effectively we were a one-stop Google for when it came to exploits. Bear in mind, this was 1999, and we used to host it, and we used to get owned a lot, and we used to move it around. In hindsight, probably not the best thing to do, but we were young and naive, and it served the purpose that we thought. But it was a key part of the scene back then. EL8 took a lot of offense against this. And their message now, if you look 20 years later, is quite important because, for those who remember BugTrack was effectively the place you'd go to disclose a lot of the bugs that you had. It was also great as an attacker to understand what I could own and what I could weaponize, and they went against it. This kind of made me realize that, I know my Portuguese is terrible, that something had to drastically change. Now, like I said, I've had a lot of personal impact where people were using our research for bad. So I used to run a company called SensePost, and we used to push out a lot of offensive weapons out there. One of the weapons was called Quetzal. Quetzal was an idea by Chris to take a Android APK and easily backdoor it where you didn't require any skills, so you could push it out and have a backdoored version of an application. Sounds good. It was used to highlight the fact that Google Play Store and Android itself wasn't very good at detecting this. What we didn't expect was the hundreds of YouTube tutorials by so many people that were now using this to own a lot of people. And the ramp up from proof of concept to weaponized code was something like I've never seen before. Then, in 2011, a colleague of mine, Glenn, and I had a research idea to build a thing called Snoopy. Snoopy was a distributed mass surveillance system that made use of a flaw that we found in the Wi-Fi stack, and we did so by doing a proof of concept in two places. One, we did it in London. We built our drones, and we went through all the major hotspots in London during rush hour and caught about 100,000 people in our dragnet. This was pre-Snowden. And we were able to track where that person was coming from, where they lived, their common places of interest, and so on. But there was an element to Snoopy that we wanted to try out that was a lot more evil, and that was the malicious, full, active exploitation. And where best to try this out than Black Hat? Because if you go to the Black Hat conference and you are not doing good security on your mobile phone, well, you're an idiot. So I spoke to Jeff and Ping and said, listen, here is our idea. We want to put up a dragnet of malicious drones all over the place and pwn the crap out of everybody connecting into it. They're like, sure, it's Black Hat, go ahead. And we did. Tens of thousands of people had their devices owned. We proved the point. It got picked up. We worked with Google and Android to fix the flaw. What we didn't expect was how the Snoopy technology would be used in a malicious way. And it was only years afterwards did we get insight that there were companies in Israel selling Snoopy-based technology to spy on Palestinians, or where our research was being found in the Middle East or parts of Eastern Europe where they didn't care about who they went after. And even closer to home, a company decided to use the Snoopy technology to spy on people via the bins. We never imagined this to be happening, but we were incredibly naive at the time. So the whole anti-sec movement actually had a point, because we were helping people do nasty stuff. Now, I thought it quite fitting that 20 years after the policy came out, and not many people knowing about it, it was probably maybe the good time to start rethinking about that. And the policy itself is quite simple, right? It's also very controversial. Do not tell the world about security bugs you find. How many people here have found bugs in the last year and publicly told people about them? How many have managed to find those bugs and do responsible disclosure with the vendor? Quite a few. It is a very frustrating process to do. Vendors do not want to listen. There is an argument for proof of concepts. There's not an argument for taking a proof of concept and putting it on the internet. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I'm starting to see that this industry needs. We need to become a little bit more responsible. We have responsible drink driving, if ever there was such a thing. We have responsible drinking. So why don't we have responsible research? Because, as I showed earlier, we do have the capability of really impacting how this world works through code, through our keyboards. And Maggie Stone, who is part of Google Project Zero, obviously has a counter-argument. Google Project Zero, very good friends of mine, do an amazing thing for this world. They really do. What Ben and Parissa have done is phenomenal. But she also has a point. By providing proof of concepts, it does help those stubborn vendors understand that it's not really acceptable for you to push out bad quality code anymore. And I think that's where this industry needs to grow up a little bit. We still accept poor code, and that's something that needs to change. But it's not all bad things. The hacking community is still very, very well alive. So last week, Phineas Fisher, who is a he, she, it, we're not sure, could be a group, a phenomenal hacker, decided to do something quite interesting. They hacked a bank in the Cayman Islands, and they managed to steal a lot of money, and they've put together a bug bounty for hackers to go after companies that do bad things. The NSOs of the world, the Halliburtons, and so on. So the hacking community is still there. We're not all corporate shills, and we're not all dangerous anymore because we don't do anything cool. But I still think we have an amazing thing to shape this fourth industrial revolution that we're all going through. Because we can collaborate a lot. For those who don't know that is the legendary white wrapper called Vanilla Ice. Very misunderstood. So, my call to you today after you see all these amazing talks is we do cool stuff. We learn, we share, but there's an element of responsibility we also need to start thinking about now. Because you are being watched. It's inevitable. So, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
So, any questions? Oh, sorry.
Hello, Daniel. So I have a question regarding conferences, because I think that, as I talked about yesterday, I think there's some sort of glamorization, I think, of security research. There's this special status that we give to researchers, and for some people their motivation is to go public at some point with their research, right? So how does the industry then move to a position where we support a different sort of framework of working? Because the ideas that you're talking about can't exist in the current structure, the way that we talk about ideas with each other.
It's a good question. One of the things that we're trying to drive at, say, Black Hat is previously you would idolize and call somebody releasing exploit code that made, say, this Papa Root shell as a rock star. And I think that's been the wrong attitude to have, because I'm going to be very controversial now. It's not hard to hack anymore. I'm sorry. It really isn't. What's really hard to do is to stop stuff like this being exploited. And I think we've put the wrong emphasis on the rock stars, the mega security researchers who do that kind of stuff, rather than celebrate those who are actually protecting, critical infrastructure, protecting ATM networks, protecting pacemakers from being owned. And I think we need a massive shift where we, the industry, go, do you know what, that's just not that cool anymore. Like, you managed to get a internet-connected dildo to do something. Cool, bro. We need to move away from that. But I think it's going to take a lot more than just idiots like me rambling to a lot of you going, that's just not cool anymore. So I don't have an easy answer, and I think it's a very hard problem that we're going to have to try and fix, but I'm hoping we're going to try and at least talk about it.
else?
Always a good sign when there's no questions.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much, Daniel.